Hi friends, it's your boy Cranberry Enthusiast, and welcome to this exciting episode of the series in which we are reading the book of Daniel and talking about all the wild things going on. And also happy May, even though it's not May when I'm recording this, but it's May when this video is going to be coming out. As always, this is kind of a traditional thing I say for this series, but it's nice because there's 12 chapters in the book of Daniel, and there's 12 months in our year, essentially. It's interesting. It's the history of months and the different cultures having different months is really interesting. Anyway, but without further ado, shall we get started? Yeah? Alright. We are in chapter 5 today. I'm also, thankfully, at the tail end of a terrible illness known as a common cold. But yeah, so without further ado, let's get right into it, shall we? Alright, so chapter 5, and I guess here a little bit of context. So if you remember from last time, it was kind of like, chapter 4 was essentially like a letter written to kind of the general population, it kind of seemed like to me, about his dream and experiences and stuff. So this is, well, we're going to find out. We're jumping forward in time a bit, and Nebuchadnezzar's son is now king of Babylon, if I remember this right. I'm sure we'll get the details here, but let's stop delaying the beginning and let's just get right into it, okay? Alright, chapter 5. Belshazzar, the king, held a great feast for 1,000 of his nobles, and he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000. Obviously it means that, you know, he has this great feast, big party, 1,000 people, like 1,000 nobles, which, that's a huge, you know, that's like a small concert venue. So I love it, I mean, I'm sure not the only one who's drinking wine, but just the fact that he was drinking wine in the presence of the 1,000 sounds like he's like on stage drinking wine and 1,000 people are watching him drink wine. But no, what it actually probably more reflects is that he's having this great feast and he's at ease. He's drinking wine. He's kind of, yeah. Okay, let's continue. Well, he tasted the wine. Belshazzar gave orders to bring the gold and silver vessels, which his father, Nebuchadnezzar. So there we go. Belshazzar is Nebuchadnezzar's son. How about that? His successor is king. So Nebuchadnezzar's probably passed away at this point. Which his father Nebuchadnezzar had taken out of the temple which was in Jerusalem, so that the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines could drink out of them. Then they brought out the gold vessels that had been taken out of the temple, the house of God which was in Jerusalem, and the king and his nobles, his wives, and his concubines drank out of them. So, a little bit of history, and I don't know all the exact details, but basically, that's kind of like a no, like a thing that is not good to do. Why? Because these items here, if you follow the biblical narrative, the gold vessels that were in the temple and stuff, they were not just for anybody to use. They were kind of like consecrated things. In other words, you know, they're set apart for God, and they're not just for, you know, your college party or whatever. Which, I wonder how old Belshazzar was here, which, I mean, I don't know. He probably wasn't crazy old, because people didn't seem to live super long back then. But still, he's like having this big party, and he wants to like bring out gold and silver vessels, things that are, I mean, really, you know, looking really fancy. I wonder what kind of was his thought with that, because as spoiler alert, we're gonna see later, he kind of probably should have known better, or at least had an inclination toward that. But yeah, I just wonder what he was thinking, if it was like he was trying to show off to all his nobles, or if he was like trying to quote unquote assert his like dominance over all other cultural things, or I don't know. But anyway, let's continue. They drank the wine and praised the gods of gold and silver, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone. Yeah. So basically, they're like, you know, they're taking stuff that is consecrated for God, basically. It's set apart, and they're using it for their own pleasure, their own personal, you know, kind of like treating the sacred as like not sacred. And then they're also praising the gods of gold and silver. So they're praising like idols, which in this time, if it's anything like back in chapter 3, it would be, you know, like idols made by human hands, so to speak. Which is kind of, it's hard in our culture to really think about that, but when you think about deeper of what idolatry is, it's like, you know, what are you treating as like worthy of your, like anything that is valuable that you can give. And the kind of the definition of worship can be complicated. I'm still like working to try to like get myself a whole mental picture of what it means to worship, or whether you know you're worshiping something or not. And there's definitely levels and stuff, but all in all, like idolatry and even in our modern culture, I am convinced is very alive and well, and it's very easy to create idols for yourself. Usually, you know, it's not like you're making things or whatever. It's not like your Funko Pops, you buy a bunch so that you can worship them or whatever, or like, you know. But it's stuff that, you know, if you put if you treat things, I mean, really, like, as a baseline, if you know, you're treating your Funko Pops better than like you treat God, obviously that would seem like there'd be kind of a little problem there. But anyway, I could talk a lot more about that, but let's just continue for now and see what happens. So, you know, the scene is set. Belshazzar is kind of doing, you know, he's kind of treating God's glasses, cups, and cutlery as like kind of just like, he's kind of dishonoring God through that. So, you know, I wonder how this is going to turn out. Continuing on, suddenly the fingers of a human hand emerged. Just a human hand appears. I wonder how big the human hand was. And began writing opposite the lampstand on the plaster of the wall of the king's palace. And the king saw the back of the hand that did the writing. So it seems like it's kind of a disembodied hand, which I wonder how exactly. I can just use my own hand for as an example. So yeah, and so like, man, yeah, kind of a warning sign. I wonder how the king responds here. Then the king's face became pale, and his thoughts alarmed him, and his hip joints loosened, and his knees began knocking together. In other words, the king is kind of freaked out. He knows, you know, as probably anyone would be, you know, if a hand appears in your room or whatever and starts writing on the wall, be like, yeah, be pretty serious. Of course, with knowing this account, like, yeah, it seems like it's not good if there's going to be a hand that's writing on the wall. Which, shout out, this is where the popular phrase, you know, the writing is on the wall. You probably already knew that, but this is where that phrase comes from. So anyway, so the king kind of knows, you know, and he probably already knows that something weird is going on. It's not like he's like, I mean, he's really like afraid here, as obvious because his face is pale, his thoughts are alarming him, his hip joints loosened, and his knees are knocking together. Yeah. Alright. I love the vivid imagery there. The king called aloud to bring in the sorcerers, the Chaldeans, and the diviners. The king began speaking and said to the wise men of Babylon, anyone who can read this inscription and explain its interpretation to me shall be clothed with purple, and have a necklace of gold around his neck, and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. So the king is like, hey, I'm really freaked out. I want to know what this message means, because like the hand wrote something on the wall. Probably then the hand disappeared, I imagine. I imagine it's not still like sitting there in the... So, and he's like, anyone who can read this inscription and explain it shall be clothed with purple, signifying royalty. Purple's color of royalty. And like people, you know, with honor and authority. And have a necklace of gold around his neck. Fancy. I have a necklace of gold around my neck, but it's not actual gold, I don't think. If it was, well, anyway, we will get to that later. Probably. and have authority as third ruler in the kingdom. So it's like, and I wonder, so the third ruler, I'm trying to remember, was Daniel the second in command under Nebuchadnezzar? I'm trying to find this here. He made him ruler over the entire province of Babylon, chief prefect over all the wise men of Babylon. So Daniel was up pretty high. I don't know if, like, that obviously the position of third ruler isn't quite. I wonder who's the second ruler here. If maybe it still is Daniel, if Belshazzar, if he was the second, I don't know. Doesn't seem to say, but that's okay. Then all the king's wise men, all the king's horses and all the king's men, then all the king's wise men came in. They could not read the inscription or make known its interpretation to the king. A kind of recurring theme in Daniel is like all the secular, like worldly magicians and wise men are like, they're kind of useless. And actually, next chapter it's going to be very interesting, the development. But so stay tuned for June's video. Let's see, so they don't know. Then King Belshazzar was greatly alarmed, his face grew even more pale, and his nobles were perplexed. I love the phrase there. So his nobles, so the king's terrified, his nobles are like, they're just like scratching their chins, and just very perplexing. I'm sure they were probably afraid too. So the queen, probably the mother of Belshazzar, one of the wives of Nebuchadnezzar, or maybe a concubine, I don't know. It's interesting, like, wives and concubines are similar, but it seems like wives had more privileges than concubines. Like, if you were someone's wife, you had greater things back then with polygamy among kings is kind of the really, I can't understand. Anyway. So the queen entered the banquet hall. Because of the words of the king and his nobles, the queen began to speak and said, "O king, live forever. Do not let your thoughts alarm you, or your face be pale." Are you eating enough? Are you? I'm sure that's not the thing, and she probably didn't use those maybe exact words there, but it's funny. Yeah, just, someone who's terrified, hey, don't let your thoughts alarm you. Also, don't let your face be pale. Like that. Like, that's something that someone can physically control. But the point being, she's saying, don't be afraid. Like, you're freaking out. Hey, take a deep breath. Don't be afraid. And why? She continues, there is a man in your kingdom in whom is a spirit of the holy gods, and in the days of your father, illumination, insight, and wisdom like the wisdom of the gods were found in him. We've just gone over several accounts of those earlier in this series. Referring to Daniel, of course. And King Nebuchadnezzar, your father the king, appointed him chief of the soothsayer priests, sorcerers, Chaldeans, and diviners. I need to really look up how to pronounce that. This was because an extraordinary spirit, knowledge and insight, interpretation of dreams, explanation of riddles, and solving of difficult problems were found in this Daniel, whom the king named Belshazzar, something. Let Daniel now be summoned, and he will declare the interpretation. So the queen is like, never fear, Daniel is somewhere here. And so this is going to be interesting. So, and obviously God has given Daniel a great gift and the ability, and Daniel seems like he's pretty in tune with God, so to speak. Like he is very much, and very much seems to have an accurate thing of himself, where he's like, yeah, I'm not anybody, like, like God is the one who's revealing, like he's talked about with Nebuchadnezzar earlier. God reveals interpretation and stuff, and anyway, so let's see what happens here. Then Daniel was brought in before the king. The king began speaking and said to Daniel, "Are you that Daniel who is one of the exiles from Judah, whom my father the king brought from Judah?" And Daniel must have nodded or something, maybe. "Now I have heard about you, that a spirit of the gods is in you, and that illumination, insight, and extraordinary wisdom have been found in you. Just now the wise men and the sorcerers were brought in before me to read this inscription and make its interpretation known to me, but they could not declare the interpretation of the message." The wise men and the sorcerers rolled all natural ones on there. "But I personally have heard about you, that you are able to give interpretations and solve difficult problems. Now, if you are able to read the inscription and make its interpretation known to me, you will be clothed with purple and wear a necklace of gold around your neck, and you will have authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So he's like, hey, big reward for whoever can figure this out. Which I wonder too, like, just an interesting thought, like why none of like the wise men, like the secular wise men and stuff, why they didn't just make up something, like, you know, who would have been the wiser, so to speak, which, and you know, if you're the only one who can find it out, how can you know that it's like, yeah, that's an interesting thing, but probably, like, I don't know, maybe people just didn't think about it, or yeah, I don't know. So anyway, he presents that to Daniel. Then Daniel replied and said before the king, keep your gifts for yourself, or give your rewards to someone else. However, I will read the inscription to the king and make the interpretation known to him. So Daniel's like, yeah, I don't really care about, you know, the gifts and reward, but, you know, I'll do this anyway. O king, the Most High God granted sovereignty, greatness, honor, and majesty to Nebuchadnezzar your father. Now because of the greatness which he granted him, all the peoples, nations, and populations of all languages trembled and feared in his presence. Whomever he wished he killed, and whomever he wished he spared alive, and whomever he wished he elevated, and whomever he wished he humbled. But when his heart was arrogant, and his spirit became so overbearing that he behaved presumptuously, he was deposed from his royal throne, and his dignity was taken away from him. We went over the account of that. Nebuchadnezzar's own account seemed last chapter. He was also driven away from mankind, and his heart was made like that of animals, and his dwelling place was with the wild donkeys. He was given grass to eat like cattle, and his body was drenched with the dew of heaven, until he recognized that the Most High God is ruler over the realm of mankind, and that he sets it over whomever he wishes. So, Daniel starts out by being like, hey, Nebuchadnezzar, your father, which I'm assuming it's his biological father, but it could also just mean like the king who was before king, which before Belshazzar, yeah. There's Belshazzar, then Daniel's also called Belteshazzar. It's like Shazam. Anyway, but I would imagine it would be biological though, because people tended to do that in those days, and throughout history. Even I think of King Henry VIII. He really wanted a son to succeed him, and he got married 6 times. He divorced 2 of his wives, had another 2 beheaded. 1 died of natural causes, supposedly, and the last outlived him. So anyway, and all because like he wanted them to give him a son, which they eventually did, but I think his son passed away when he was young, and then was that when one of the Queen Elizabeths became queen? Or anyway, enough English history for this chapter here. So anyway, so Daniel's reminding him, hey, you know, your father, the king, was like you, Nebuchadnezzar. He had all this stuff, and then he had actually that all taken away from him, until he recognized, you know, that God is God, basically, and that God is actually the one who's in charge here. And yeah, the guy had a lot of like physical earthly power, but can all be taken away from him just like that. So it really is not, you know, it was given to Nebuchadnezzar, it wasn't Nebuchadnezzar's own doing. So anyway, so he begins with that. Daniel continues, yet you, his son, Belshazzar, have not humbled your heart, even though you knew all this. So there we go. So like Belshazzar would have known about his father's experiences with the God of heaven. And so anyway, Daniel continues, but you have risen up against the Lord of heaven, and they have brought the vessels of his house before you, and you and your nobles, your wives, and your concubines have been drinking wine out of them, and you have praised the gods of silver and gold, of bronze, iron, wood, and stone, which do not see, nor hear, nor understand, but the God in whose hand are your life breath, and all your ways you have not glorified. Man, that's a really sobering thing, which it seemed like that Belshazzar was kind of almost like he kind of knew that, and Daniel says, even though you knew it all, but so you're still, you know, you're not glorifying God, you're worshiping false idols that don't even exist, just they don't see, hear, understand. And that's it's a really kind of powerful statement. But the God in whose hand are your life breath and all your ways, you know. I think of a passage in Acts where Paul talks about we live and move and have our very being in God. And So, but yeah, you have not glorified. And that's like really sober. Which I wonder how Belshazzar is gonna react. Like, is he gonna be like super crazy angry, or like what is his response here gonna be? Let's continue. And Daniel continues. Then the hand was sent from him, meaning God, and this inscription was written out. Now this is the inscription that was written. Mene, mene, tekel, upharsin. Upharsin. And I actually have notes here. Well, and so let's go through what Daniel says, and then I'll add the notes. So Daniel says, this is the interpretation of the message. Mene, which appears twice, God has numbered your kingdom and put it into it. And note here is, or amina, 50 shekels from the verb to count. So, counted. Daniel continues, tekel, you have been weighed on the scales and found deficient. Or shekel from a verb to weigh. So, you've been counted, weighed, and Paris, your kingdom, which is a Pharzim, it must be from Paris or something. Your kingdom has been divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Or half shekel from the verb to divide. So, basically the thing, so Daniel spells it out really clearly, but the more, like, the literal thing would be like the life and kingdom of Belshazzar has been counted, it's been weighed, and found, lacking, and so the kingdom's going to be divided and given to the Medes and Persians. Alright, now, what will Belshazzar do? Then Belshazzar gave orders, and they clothed Daniel with purple and put a necklace of gold around his neck and issued a proclamation concerning him that he now had authority as the third ruler in the kingdom. So, shout out Belshazzar. He, kept his word. It doesn't really say his attitude per se, but, and maybe he was hoping, like, oh, if I honor Daniel this way, then maybe, like, all that bad stuff won't happen to me. Like, maybe I'll be able to keep the kingdom and stuff. Or, like, maybe he didn't believe him or anything. Or maybe, we don't entirely know here. But at least he wasn't like, throw Daniel into the fiery furnace. Or, he obviously respected Daniel enough that he, and I don't know, did he have a change of heart, or was he like, did he not care? I don't know. It doesn't quite say. But continuing on, that same night, Belshazzar, the Chaldean king, was killed. Shout out how, like no real details, but like, that same night he was killed. And finishing up the chapter, so Darius the Mede received the kingdom at about the age of 62. Oh wow, so King Darius is actually kind of up there, which I guess the kings and nobility would be like older and stuff, but having a slightly better quality of life, although in America most people live, way better than probably any of the ancient kings and stuff, with all the technological advances and whatnot, and just the knowledge of science and things. But so anyway, so that's very kind of sobering here. So it was like, and I remember hearing things about how that happened, because it was, someone did a study, I thought, about like how Babylon was overthrown by the Persians and Medes, and I'd have to look it up again, but I remember hearing stories about how they had actually used like the waterways, so like a bunch of like the invading army was able to sneak into the city and like kind of probably sprang upon the nobles and everything while the party was happening. And so, but yeah, because that same night Belshazzar the Chaldean king was killed. So Babylon is now fallen, in the sense that it's been taken over by the Medes and Persians. And so, yeah. So definitely a sobering passage to know that, to definitely, learn from the people who came before you, and people who have gone through things, and who, like, who God has taught, and if you've learned from the things that God has taught them, to definitely pay attention to those. And to, Yeah, very, very interesting. So I think that's about everything I can think of for this chapter. I'm trying to think if I have any final thoughts. I do like genuinely wonder too, like what Belshazzar, what his thing was, like if he was by giving Daniel those awards, which kind of ended up being worthless, of course. Um, like if that means that Daniel like, or that he was trying to again like buy off the judgment that Daniel was proclaiming, or like if he was like didn't believe him, but he was like, hey, you know, I said that if you could interpret it, and I believe you've interpreted it, and so I'm gonna honor you anyway. But definitely doesn't say that he like, you know, got on his knees and like begged for mercy or like anything like that. So yeah, it's anyway. Point being, don't be like Belshazzar. Be more like Daniel. And yeah, I guess that will do it for this episode. Thank you all so much for watching, and we will see you all again absolutely very soon.